The Laravel 12 has just come out, and it's got some new starter kits, which I absolutely love. They look great, they feel great to use, in my opinion, but there's a lot of controversy around them. They're replacing the old Breeze and Jetstream starters that we've been used to from the last couple of versions of Laravel. And I've got a couple of ideas on how the installation process for Laravel could maybe be improved or tweaked for potentially both improving the experience for new people to Laravel, it's people that don't know the ecosystem already, but also making it a little bit more powerful for the people that do already know Laravel and the ecosystem quite well. So the way I'm going to do this is I've just created a little bit of a mock application, which we're going to go through. I'm going to run this install command, which I've mocked up. So this is what I think the new Laravel installer could look like potentially. And even before this, I think potentially when you first run Laravel new, there could be two different options. One for just having a basic standard install, like the recommended thing. So if someone's just completely new and coming to Laravel, then it'll just give them the recommended things. Maybe it'll give them the option of the 3 starter kits, so Livewire, React, or Vue. And that's basically all. Like the rest, it could just use SQLite for the default database and everything. You don't really need to make that an option if someone is just getting started and just going through that. But if someone wants a bit more of an advanced option, you can have that second option and go through a bit more of a complex installer. Something that's going to be a bit more powerful, set up an application a bit more fully to what someone is actually going to be building with. So this here is going through that second one. So at the beginning, it looks the same. What's the name of your project? I'm going to call our project Firestarter. You can get a short description of your project as well. And you might question why you would put this in the installer, but it can be a little bit helpful to have this here, because then we can fill it out in the README, we can fill it out in the composer.json description, and a handful of other places where it's just going to be a short description that's reused in a couple of different places. So being able to set that up once saves us from having to do it in multiple other places. So I'm going to just fill this out with a application starter kit. Why not? And now this is the first main difference that I think is going to be a huge improvement for people newly coming to Laravel and not necessarily knowing what they want to configure. Because right now, if you run the current installer, the first thing you're asked is, do you want Livewire or Vue or React? And a lot of people are just going to go, what's Livewire? What's inertia? And they're not necessarily going to know what the different options mean and how that's going to affect them later down the line. So one of the common complaints I've seen is there's no plain API starter. But there's a couple of other things I've seen as well. Why is there no CLI starter? And why native PHP is getting big as well right now. So we're probably going to be seeing a lot of people building mobile or desktop applications using Laravel. So if we take a step back from everything, what type of application are you trying to build first? The default, what most people are going to be doing, is the web and web app and website kind of applications like we're all used to. But if you chose API instead, you could get a bit of a different setup. It could set up some of the auth in a different way, because you're not going to need all of the same auth views and controllers and everything set up. It might also do a couple of other things, get rid of the web routes and only keep the API routes, so on and so forth. CLI, if you're just building a CLI application that doesn't need an entire web framework, Laravel Zero is a project that does that pretty well. So either we could build a project like that, just have a really nice entry point to building a command using all of Laravel's powerful features, or maybe Laravel could just do that in a plain application on its own. Or if you're building an app, use native PHP. It's basically a fresh Laravel application, but you throw in a package and configure a couple of extra things and build steps. But I feel like this as a whole now is giving a more thorough picture of letting people build what they want and not just assuming they're building a web application, which is not everyone's case necessarily, even though it's the main case. So if we select web app here, now we're going to be presented with a kind of familiar thing. What front end do you want to use? So we have the same things as we have with the current Laravel starter. We've got Livewire, React, and Vue. But I've also added a blade option here. If people don't really want to use Livewire or React or Vue, they just want a very plain, basic application with standard HTTP controllers, standard blade views. That's how this could be configured. If, however, I choose Livewire, then you can choose between class-based components or Vault components. It seems like a lot of people have a preference towards Vault components right now, but there's also a lot of backlash from that being the only decision. And I've seen that as of like a few hours ago, Laravel has added this option to the standard installer to choose between class-based or Vault components. So that's pretty great. Next up, I think this is an interesting one. Does your app need to be translated into multiple languages? I think by default, the Laravel starter kits are assuming that an application is going to be translated, because if you have a blade view somewhere, it's going to be having something like this set up where you've got this underscore function that's being called with the text, which is really confusing if you're a newcomer coming and seeing this. And I'm pretty much, I can guarantee 99% of Laravel applications are not being translated, are not set up to be translated in any way. So coming in and seeing this is insanely confusing when you could just see the text as it is, and that would be pretty easy to do. I've also got real big concerns about having this as the default way to do things, because it's really just, it's not a good way to handle translations. If anything, you'd want to be using something like auth.login, or you'd want to be using these kind of string keys that you can set up with Laravel's translation system. I could go on about that for a long time, but this is better, but it's a lot more confusing, especially if you are not familiar with Laravel's translation system. So I get why they've done this, but again, 99% of applications are never going to use this, and it's just going to be confusing and stripped out. So maybe this option could just strip out that the function and the blade calls around it, and just have a plain login text. So we're going to select no, we're not going to translate our application. Next up, is your application going to have authentication? You get the basic no option, or the basic database authentication, or the new SSO with WorkOS. For this, I'm just going to choose the basic database authentication. And now we get a very familiar thing that we've seen with the previous Laravel installer as well. We get to select a bunch of the auth features that you want. So I can come in and select Socialite, email verification, 2FA, API token authentication with Passport, SPA authentication with Sanctum, and Teams. And again, these are things the current installer doesn't do, but I know the Laravel team is working on bringing these kind of features back to the starter kits. So I assume this will come in at some point anyway. Next up, choosing what test framework you want to use. Pretty similar to what we've got already. But on top of that, a lot of people are doing browser testing, and it's a quite powerful way to test web applications without having to do a bunch of extra work in other places to be able to manually test if your UI is working. So why not offer a browser testing tool out of the box, because so many people need it? Obviously, Laravel Dusk is the default option, but Laracast also has a Cypress package that you can install if you want to use Cypress. I know Nuno Maduro was talking about making a Playwright driver for Pest to be able to call Playwright directly from there. So why not make these options here and just let people get browser testing out of the box? Next up, setting your database. Pretty standard as well. And we can run the default migrations. The next one I've got here is this option. Do you want to use some suggested strict settings? And this is another controversial one. I don't know if this should necessarily even be an option in the installer, but I'm seeing people do this a lot more now, which is in any new application they start up, they're going to be a little bit more strict. So they're going to enable strict models. They're going to prohibit destructive commands in production. They're going to be using immutable dates by default. And each of those are only a couple of lines to add to your app service provider. But what if we just have an option to enable all of those by default and have a bit more of a stricter application from the get-go? If not that, then maybe they could just be commented out inside the default app service provider or something like that, so that they're not necessarily a step that stops you from getting into your application and starting a new one, but they'd be really easy to enable without having to know specifically about these features when you go into your app service provider for the first time. So I'll select yes on this. Next up, what static analysis tool do you want to use? Lots of people are using static analysis tools now. PHP isn't just being seen as this really loosely typed language that no one cares about what data is being passed around. It's a real strict programming language and can be really powerful. So let's choose a static analysis tool. You can choose PHP, Sun, or SARM, but if someone familiar with PHP comes to Laravel and tries to install one of these, they're going to have a bit of a rough time because Laravel does a lot of magic. It's going to do things that these static analysis tools just aren't going to pick up or understand. So with PHP Stan, there's a package called Larastan, which builds on top of that. And for SARM, there's a Laravel plugin as well. So both of those tools could implicitly use the Laravel version of that tool in order to bring rich Laravel static analysis to a developer from the very get-go. Moving on from there, how do you want to collect telemetry data for your application? It's not a question a lot of people ask, but I think it's maybe something that's important to ask as early on as the installer, because collecting telemetry data for any application that goes into production is going to be useful. And obviously Laravel thinks this is an important thing as well, because they're coming out with a new product called Nightwatch, which is basically observability and telemetry. So this is a chance to kind of push people towards Laravel Nightwatch potentially. Or alternatively, you could use OpenTelemetry. So if I select this OpenTelemetry option here, it would install the OpenTelemetry Laravel auto instrumentation package, and that's just going to start collecting data about the queries I'm making, the requests I'm making, how many requests I'm getting and responses I'm giving to the server. So you could select that, and it'd be really useful out of the box. Next up, what web server do you want to use? I think Laravel by default comes with config for both Nginx and Apache, but you can just choose one or the other and delete the other one. Alternatively, you could just use Octane out of the box. Just make sure that you've got Octane installed from the get-go with the drivers that you want to use, and from a very fresh application, just be using that without having to think about setting it up later. And now we're done with a lot of the setting up the application itself. I think I'm moving on to some of the other repository related things. So first of all, do you want to initialize a Git repository? Probably yes. We're probably always going to want to initialize a Git repository, so let's just do that. And when we initialize that Git repository, it doesn't just have to run git init, but we could also add all of the code that's generated from this point onwards as an initial commit. That way, if we go in and we start coding our application and we make some changes, and we want to diff what those changes were compared to the basic starter application, well, previously we couldn't do that, but if we make that initial commit for people anyway, then we're going to be able to see the changes that we wrote specifically compared to what Laravel did as the basic install. Next up from that, what basically everyone does when making an application is you've got a Git repository. You want to go and push that Git repository to a remote server somewhere, whether that's GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or your own custom thing. So let's just set that up in the installer, get it out of the way for people so they don't have to think about it later. You could use the GitHub API or maybe even the GitHub CLI to create one for you if you select this. And it can go and create it with a the application name that we gave it earlier on as well. Alternatively, you could just let them add a link to the remote repository themselves. But if I select create one on GitHub for me, it's going to go and do that. But now it's also detected, hey, we've got a Git repository on GitHub. Do you want to use GitHub Actions for CI/CD? Well, yes, I do. But setting that up is a bit of a pain each time, especially if you're coming to it for the first time. So if you want to go from having a brand new application to having like a steady environment, you're sure your things are running properly. It's not necessarily just running your unit tests on your local environment that is going to be good enough. Especially if you're starting to use Laravel on a team, you really want to just get CI/CD set up out the way. So because at this point, we know that we're using Pest, we know that we're using Playwright, we know that we're using SAM as well, or PHP stan. We've got that information. We can go and generate some GitHub action workflows that run those things for you. So let's do that. Next up, how do you want to run it locally? Well, we could use Docker for our local environment, or not. I'm assuming most people aren't going to want to. Personally, I like to, and I think it's really important to push for Docker when we can, especially when working with multiple teams. So let's say we're going to use Docker. Either that could use Laravel Sail, or we can configure a custom Docker file for our PHP environment, a custom Docker Compose file that's going to get all of the dependencies that we need for our application. So, for example, if we've selected OpenTelemetry, we need a PHP extension for that. We know about that, so we can put that in the Docker file to create a PHP image. Similarly, if we choose something like MS SQL Server for our database driver, we can create an image for that in Docker Compose, and we can make sure that we require that extension that is needed for PDO to use MS SQL in our PHP image. Next up, how do you want to deploy your application? We've got the CI/CD, we've got the local development, it's all good. But when you come to deploy your application, that seems like it's becoming a huge part of Laravel's motto right now. Ship it, just get out there fast. Go from new application to deployment as fast as possible. Just get something out there. Get that feedback loop really fast. So how fast can you get it other than choosing how you want to deploy your application immediately when you're first creating it? If you know that you want to have your application go really quickly from being fresh to just being somewhere you can share it with people, you can come in here and you can select Laravel Cloud. And again, this is a place that Laravel can start to push some of their other premium products to try and get a little bit of a kickback to help fund the development of Laravel. So if I come in here and I select Cloud, that's going to give us a couple more options to go through and select that up. That might be calling the Cloud API, or maybe eventually we'll have a Cloud CLI behind the scenes as well that we can use to create things like this. So I'll select the closest region to me, and we'll go on, and that will start deploying that application to cloud, especially because we have the Git remote set up, so it has all the information that we need to be able to do that. And that's basically the whole installation process, but I think there's one more little step, which is you've got everything set up in your folder, but there's a couple of manual actions you need to take before you can really do anything with your application. So number one, do you want to open the application in your IDE? We can detect the editor variable in your shell and see if it's like PHP Storm or Sublime or VS Code. And if it's set to something, then we can offer this prompt and just open that folder in your editor for you. You don't have to go and manually find the folder and open it up. Next up, do you want to run the application locally? Well, we can just run PHP artisan serve, or composer run dev, or PHP octane start, artisan octane start, or whatever. We can just have this here and have the application running immediately so we can see what it looks like. And the very last thing, now the application's running, we can just open it in our browser if we've got a web application. So we run that, and it's going to give us the option to just have that immediately in our face. It's going to open a couple of windows because it's going to open our editor, it's going to open our browser. But if we do that, then we've gone from just typing in a couple of commands and choosing some options really quickly to having a fully fledged development environment that we can do. We can just push our changes immediately and see them deployed on cloud within literally minutes, the entire flow. So I think that's where the installer could go. I don't necessarily think all of this is going to be good for someone that's new to Laravel. I think there's a lot that can be removed. But for anyone that is already familiar with Laravel, building new applications frequently, I think all of the options here would be really, really useful to be able to pull in.